G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. In today's video, we're going through my team selection for the Mexican Grand Prix. You know what the drill is. Show some love to the channel. Please drop a like on the video, subscribe to it if you haven't done so already. We're getting very close to 9,500 subscribers for the channel's life, so any additional support you can show is definitely appreciated. But let's get straight into how the team firstly did in Circuit of the Americas and what this means for my team in Mexico. I had 240 points. Generally speaking, that's not a bad score. But as you guys know, if you follow me on Twitter, I was deliberating about using the 3X chip in Austin. I was probably about 50-50 heading into Friday, and I was toing and froing as to whether or not to go down that path. And I ultimately came to the decision that I thought for my team, with the budget I had, it felt like a good time to use the chip. I don't expect it to be a perfect weekend when I use a lot of these chips because you just can never predict the DNF chaos that runs rife through F1 fantasy. But I got to practice and sprint qualifying, and it looked to me that Max Verstappen and the two McLarens were definitely the fastest cars on track. Max had sprint pole, and then Lando and Oscar were right behind, and I thought that was going to continue to be the case throughout the weekend. So I felt pretty confident it was one of maybe only 2 times left this season, given Qatar the other sprint race with little risk compared to Brazil, which does get a bit of rain, that it would work for my team. So I elected to use the 3X chip, and I felt pretty confident about it. I wasn't expecting Oscar to win either of the sprint or the Grand Prix races, but I did feel as though he would be able to compete for podiums in both. And pretty much turn one in the sprint race, if you saw it or you know the outcome of it, put paid to any chance I had of a good weekend on the 3X chip. It was pretty much a gut punch to my team when Oscar and Lando collided on turn one. And I'm not going to get into the semantics of who was at fault, because I think you can make an argument for a number of different outcomes, but Oscar definitely probably didn't use his mirrors as well as he should have. But that pretty much ended any chance of a good weekend on the 3X chip. Max, obviously, absolute blinder of a weekend. He had won the sprint, won the Grand Prix, and had pole position in both of those. And beyond the fastest lap or the driver of the day was, in my opinion, a perfect weekend for him. So I felt as though that vindicated some of my decision. But obviously, Oscar coming away with a negative score on with the 2X applied was pretty devastating, to be honest. I didn't expect it to be great, but I didn't expect it to be that bad either. And I do pour one out for anyone that went a 3X on a Norris Piastri build, because that was, to say the least, bad luck. The pinnacle of bad luck, let's call it. So a pretty terrible outcome on the 3X chip, but Max definitely did carry the team there. 144 points, pretty remarkable. He obviously accounted for more than half of my team's total points, one driver. So I felt as though that was the right decision, but Oscar DNFing, he's really looking out of sorts at the moment. He has not looked good since the Netherlands. And to be honest with you, I'm worried that Max, hot on the heels of Lando Norris, will also reel in Oscar. We've got 6 racing sessions of points left, 4 races and 2 sprints. I think Max is just as much a chance as either of the McLaren drivers. I know if it was Oscar, he would be in the best position of the 3, but you can't back against Max, and he's looking really good right now. So, look, I think the 3X chip, I'm happy with the decision. Had I not known the outcome, I probably would have gone down that path again, but I had every expectation that there was a possibility waiting for another weekend could have been better. I wanted to play essentially what was in front of me, and I saw 2 drivers I could afford that were the top 3 at the time, and I went down that route without really having any drivers that would lose me value at the same time. So the decision I thought was a sound one, the outcome not so much, but I'm not going to harp on about good decision, bad outcome, because that gets a little stale after a while. Aside from Oscar and Max, Sainz also looked really good up until his retirement in the Grand Prix after that collision with Antonelli. He was looking pretty good up until that point. 14 points across the sprint race and the qualifying with a P9 to get into SQ3 or Q3. And then that retirement obviously pretty much ended any chance he had of another good weekend, but he still got that 0.6 price rise. So not the worst outcome. I'll try to look at a silver lining. On the other hand, however, Bortoleto didn't look so encouraging, but ultimately was well set up for a good weekend, because he was pretty much at the very back for the sprint race, made a bunch of positions up and a couple of overtakes, and then made an additional 7 overtakes, even though he lost a couple of positions in the race on the Sunday. So 17 for him, definitely a score I wasn't expecting. And then Gasly, again, as long as he doesn't DNF, and I always feel more confident than Colapinto that Gasly will at least finish the race. The scores for the Alpine drivers are never going to be that exciting. And Colapinto, to be honest, had his second best score in F1 Fantasy since joining the Alpine team, 7 points across the weekend. So obviously outscored his teammate by 4, but you're just not expecting much explosiveness in fantasy from either of those two drivers. So look, 3 is fine. And then McLaren, obviously another stinker weekend for them, 22 points because of the double DNF on the Saturday. And then Mercedes, 61, not amazing. Could have been so much better if Antonelli didn't, he could have done a lot more, put it that way. And then Russell, again, just kind of existing. Not quite the podium heroics we've come to know and accept from George Russell, but notwithstanding that, a solid weekend for him to secure more valuable points for Mercedes in the constructor title. So 240 points. I wouldn't say a terrible use, but obviously a terrible outcome of the 3X chip, with Piastri not even scoring positive points, and a rank jump of about 800. I fully expect that's going to kind of come back a little bit once other people use the 3X in Brazil, in Qatar, which is obviously disappointing. I still think top 5K is certainly on where I am at the moment, but top 1K, I'd really need a few things to go my way, and the 3X chip for other users later in the season to go horribly wrong for that to really stand a chance. So look, I'm okay with it. It's not ideal. I've had some good luck so far with other chips this season, so I'm sure I was bound to be hit with some bad luck, but you can, DNF on a 3X. It's pretty unlucky. Weekend notes for Circuit of the Americas. Max Verstappen, he's the man to beat. I don't need to say much more, to be honest, but I think in terms of F1 fantasy, his production is second to none lately, and it's hard to look past Max's form right now. He's had 3 scores of 40 or more in the last 4 race weekends, and then 27 in Singapore, which was just a P2 in qualifying and a P2 in the Grand Prix. He is definitely the form driver in F1 fantasy. I think most people are starting to migrate towards him as the 2X, and I can see why that is. McLaren seem to have taken a step back because Red Bull have taken a step forward. Particularly Norris is becoming obsolete because of his price. Yes, Max is a couple million more than Oscar Piastri, but at the same time, Max is delivering and Oscar is not. And you really want that kind of consistency from your 2X driver. So when Max Verstappen is churning out 30 or 40 plus point performances, like, what gives, right? So I think Max is in form. The car is looking good. I think the momentum is firmly with the Milton Keynes team. And now that a lot of our budgets are higher, we can afford better drivers. Max becomes a very obvious replacement for someone like Oscar Piastri on the 2X, who now has, again, had his second retirement across the last 3 race weekends. Up until that point in Baku, had gone, 40 plus races without a DNF. So Max is very good at a lot of these upcoming circuits. Brazil, Vegas, Abu Dhabi. I think Oscar's probably the man that has to get shipped out for someone like Max, who's definitely on the up. 3X and Limitless users, pretty unfortunate. I've already talked about the 3X fortunes for anyone that had Oscar Piastri in their team. Limitless, even more so, the double DNF on the Saturday really ruined any chance of McLaren triple ups working successfully. I think the other thing was that, again, Ferrari deceived us. They've done so pretty much all season. They are the new F1 fantasy troll at the moment. And because of the fact that no one really had Ferrari or even a triple up on Red Bull, because Tsunoda was one of the top scoring drivers this weekend as well, it just made it hard to make meaningful ground on Limitless. I thought up until the deadline it was a good weekend to use it, because even though it wasn't a clear-cut top 5 drivers and top 2 teams, you had a defined top 4 in Russell, Verstappen, the 2 McLarens, and then the McLaren constructor. But the fact that Leclerc and Hamilton were 2 of the 4 highest scoring drivers definitely ruined any chance of, a McLaren and a Mercedes triple up working successfully. So I do pull one out for anyone who used Limitless, because it was just bad luck. And I guess on that point, McLaren have lost the plot as an F1 fantasy asset a little bit, to be honest. I'm not suggesting they are an absolute must sell, but it is becoming hard to justify when the strength of that Red Bull, the emergence of Max Verstappen as a dominant 2x driver becomes so apparent. And I think you're looking at, let's actually go over to the statistics before we go to the budget builder. Oscar has only had one score of more than, you have to actually go back to his win, if I'm not mistaken, yes, in Zandvoort with the fastest lap, to be his last score over the last 6 races of more than 30 points. So I think that really does worry me. Lando's similar, one score above 30 in the last 5. When you compare that to the likes of Max Verstappen, again, as I said, 340 plus point performances in his last 4 races. This is a really concerning trend for me as well for McLaren. I was very much expecting them to get close to 100 points in the sprint race weekend when you look at the form guide that they've had around other sprint race weekends this season. I think Red Bull have naturally taken a step forward, and you can see that in their trend. But 22 in Austin, yes, a retirement there. 6 in Baku, yes, a retirement for Oscar there. 64, fine, but again, I'm not seeing that consistency you want for a team as well. That is 35 million or more. You can drop to Red Bull. If Max is winning every single race and Yuki is just top 8, they're going to pretty much go toe-to-toe in terms of fantasy production. So what can you do with an extra 6 million makes me wonder whether McLaren are actually bang for their buck now compared to earlier in the season. I think we've got to decide, see what practice looks like in Mexico. But right now, I don't think for a lot of low-budget teams, they are probably an asset you really need to think about owning. I think there's definitely other viable, more value options elsewhere on the grid. Speaking of value, midfield drivers aren't going to get us those $0.6 million rises we've become accustomed to anymore, or at least in Mexico. And I think it's, again, kind of by virtue of the fact that we're later in the season, there's DNFs that are hitting template B tier assets. Rises are going to become fewer and fewer. Now that also these B tier assets are increasing in price, and so those thresholds for them to reach are going to be higher and higher. So if we just go back over to the budget builder, I'll just quickly touch on what I mean by that. Only one driver has a negative score or a negative threshold, which is Yuki Tsunoda, 10 million, which is also not an easy price point for a lot of teams to get into. Yes, many of these guys only need single-digit scores to go up 0.2, but we're not seeing those 0.6 rises guaranteed like we probably were a few weeks ago. So I don't think the focus now should be on building budget at this point in the season. I've already used my 3X chip. It's points for me pretty much now until the end of the season. And I'm at a point with my budget where I think 136 is good to manipulate my team to move into other lineups. So I think, sure, there's budget protection by going for these assets at the $0.2 million price rise threshold. But I think Gasly, Colapinto, for instance, they're not dropping in price. So if you're worried about losing value, I think they're very easy entry points for teams, certainly that are at least looking to conserve their team value as opposed to be aggressive and go for those $0.6 million plays. So again, something to think about. And I do think that also then dictates how we build out our team for the upcoming race weekends. Now let's look at the asset tier ranking, because I do think there's some things to talk about and some things to maybe disregard, or assets maybe that we don't need to spend as much time on. Max and George, to me, still clear-cut great options to own in your fantasy team. Anyone that went down the George Max route feasted in Coda. Oscar, I still think is viable. He's really struggling for form and consistency right now, which worries me in his championship fight. But at his price, McLaren, I still think are the second best car on the grid right now. I think Red Bull have taken that step forward as the fastest car, or at least Max is doing that. And I think you could flip the McLaren and Red Bull either way. Right now, though, at Oscar's price, he's still relatively affordable for many teams. The problem is he's not going to scoop you the price rises anymore. He's got to get 54 points in Mexico for a 0.1 price rise. So if I'm a lower budget team under 130 million, I'd be really considering the likes of Verstappen and Russell instead, or at least one of those two drivers over someone like Piastri. And if you want to cover off the McLaren base, then maybe the constructor is viable. But again, you're going to have to consider whether or not 35 million is worth your money when Red Bull only 6 million more can enable upgrades elsewhere in your team. Lando, I wouldn't be really going there at the moment. His price just doesn't really, when you've got Max producing, enable upgrades to other parts of your team, as I've talked about. And then Ferrari, yes, I think there's an argument for Charles Leclerc, especially because he has the lowest threshold for a max rise as an A-tier driver. But to be honest, they're just too inconsistent right now. He did win at COTA last year. He finished on the podium this year. And then Ferrari, again, I think it was Sainz who won in Mexico last year. So there's some good Ferrari tracks, that have just passed and are coming up. But the consistency worries me a lot. And for right now, I'm not sure I'm sold on them just yet. I think it's probably, you can slice and dice the A-tier constructors. But for me, it's probably Red Bull, McLaren in kind of like A-tier 1, and then Mercedes A-tier 2, and then Ferrari, and then Williams, who are now an A-tier asset. Would you believe that? They're 18.5 million. Did not expect that. I wouldn't be going near Williams. The production is not there. The price rises are not there. I think they're an instant sell if you have them still in your fantasy team. Into the B-tier drivers, again, I've already talked about the fact that the A-tier thresholds are pretty high for the top drivers. The same goes for the B tier as we saw on screen before. I think Gasly and Tsunoda at their price, 4.5 million. Colapinto and Gasly, 4.5 million attainable. Tsunoda, difficult to squeeze in, and I'm still not convinced that consistency is there. I'd want to see more from him before I'm willingly making room for him in my team. Antonelli, I much prefer at his price. Yes, 5 million more, but at the same time, he has got that Mercedes car that just, I think, drives better for him than the Red Bull does for Tsunoda. And also, I think even though he did look a little shaky over the weekend, there were moments where I did think Antonelli can replicate that form once again. So one eye on him in Mexico, but right now I'd be looking at other assets in the team before you go down that path. So what does this look like for Mexico? I think there's a couple of decisions that need to be made specifically around McLaren and Oscar Piastri. Both are very kind of out of form at the moment. We know how expensive McLaren is. And I think, as I've said before, if you're a low budget team or you're looking to upgrade other parts of your team, especially maybe the double Alpine, there might be opportunities elsewhere to move into, say, a Red Bull constructor, given how good Max is looking at the moment. So without further ado, let's take a look at what we can potentially consider swapping around for this upcoming race week. I think there's probably a number of different constructor pairings, but I do want to consider the idea of deviating from Oscar Piastri, which is hard for me to swallow as a fellow Aussie. But I think fantasy-wise, there's just much more value with Max, the consistency with George. And look, I'm happy to be proven wrong. I still think at 26.3 million, he's a great value asset to own. I fully expect he could well be in my team again later in the season if I choose to part ways with him in Mexico. But I do have 3 transfers available, so I do want to explore every opportunity for alternative assets in my team. I think George Russell certainly comes into play here, just because of the fact that he is consistent. He won't be a 2x driver. That will always be reserved for Max or a McLaren. And so I think moving down to George enables me to pivot into Red Bull. I can get there in 2 moves with 0.3 spare, which then would also potentially enable me to look at other changes to my team in the B tier asset class. Now, Sainz is obviously on the down based on that DNF. We go over to the budget builder here. He needs 14 points for even the minimum price rise. I still think Sainz can outperform himself as a fantasy asset. I think he could definitely achieve 14 points even on a non-sprint weekend with how good he has been looking lately. It was an unfortunate outcome for him in the Grand Prix, but the way the Williams has firmly established themselves as the best midfield team suggests to me that 6.9 is very good value. And as I said before, I'm not looking to extract max budget gains every single race weekend. So I could potentially entertain the idea of moving him out. I could keep him for sure. I could also move him out for Liam Lawson because I couldn't and wouldn't be able to get, if I kept Sainz, get from Bortoleto to Lawson, I'd be 0.1 short. So there's that. Again, looking at the budget builder, I don't want to keep continuing to revert to the budget builder because there are so many good options. I think Hadjar could potentially be an asset to consider as well. We know typically he is a great qualifier in that car. Racing Bulls have perhaps fallen back into the midfield pack at the moment. So look, I think he's a driver that on his day can easily score 10 fantasy points. And if that's kind of what I'm expecting from him in Mexico, I wouldn't hesitate to bring him back into my team. Yes, there's obviously a consideration that needs to be made for, future budget drops, but he could easily exceed 6 points. And even if he goes down 0.2, it's not the end of the world at this point in the season for me. As I said before, points should be the focus. So I could do that. But again, what else could there be in terms of what assets we're thinking about? So if I put Bortoletto back in there, I put Oscar back in there. I think Ferrari, for me, it does worry me a little bit because they have been so misleading in practice and in qualifying. If we saw them very close to the top in all 3 free practice sessions, I would think about it, to be honest. But if they're, middle of the pack in FP1, they're good in FP2, and then they regress in FP3, it's not something I'm, awfully excited about having. Theoretically speaking, let's say I do think about them seriously. I bring them into my team. The problem is I can't quite stretch to Ferrari with George Russell, which makes it difficult for me to justify owning them. It would probably mean having to downgrade either a Sainz or a Bortoletto to get George into my team. So for argument's sake, if we can squeeze George in here, what can I get at 5.7? I really can't get anyone, to be honest. So it does bother me that I'd have to run 2 Alpines is getting an inconsistent constructor, which again doesn't really have... Again, let's have a look because I haven't looked at the pit stop points for the last couple of weeks for Ferrari specifically. But if we do filter by them, are they as dominant now as they used to be earlier in the season? It doesn't look like it. VCarb have looked really good lately. Red Bull are doing all right, maybe not so much in Austin. And then McLaren tend to scoop a few points as well. So for a few million more on Mercedes for an inconsistent constructor, I'm not sure Ferrari's worth it right now. I think there's more value to be had with a Red Bull, at which point they are 0.3 million less. And as I said, this lineup, potentially does work for my team. Hadjar or Bortoletto or even an Alonso, depending on who I think looks good there. Gasly, I think, is just going to stay there for me at 4.5. He's not going to lose value. He doesn't need to score points as long as he doesn't DNF, which I back the likelihood of that not happening more than, say, Colapinto. With 3 transfers, I actually really like the look of this lineup. Now, if we go anti-McLaren, I think there's a strong possibility some people will be thinking about that in Mexico. I could very much do this. Actually, I don't know I think I'm priced out now because Oscar's gone down 0.3. So before the Grand Prix in Coda, I was actually able to afford the Kimi Antonelli build here, but because he's gone up 0.6 and Oscar's gone down 0.3 and George has gone up 0.3, I'm now priced out of that lineup. Not ideal, obviously. If I really wanted to go for that, some people may not be able to afford even this. I could do Colapinto, I could do Alonso. Like that's pretty anti-McLaren. It's pretty aggressive. It paid off the last 2 weeks though in both Singapore and Coda. So if you think the trend continues for a 3rd week in a row, I don't hate it. I really don't hate it. If you are looking to go again anti-McLaren, but you want top drivers in top teams, like Yuki Tsunoda could be a gamble. I think a risky one at that. But again, he's someone that seems to be improving a little bit. I'm not suggesting... I think the consistency is what worries me the most about Yuki. I do really like the fact that he has kind of come forward a lot in the last few race weekends as a fantasy asset. I talked about him in my strategist selection article last week ahead of Coda, and he delivered 37 points. He also had 15 in Azerbaijan. He is trending upwards. I wouldn't say it's mind-blowing. It's not... I'm not saying it's turning heads, but I think the 37 should put him on the radar for some teams that are looking for a differential this late in the season. I don't think many people would have gone Yuki and Coda, and I fully expect he might well turn in a similar kind of 10 to 15 point performance this time around in Mexico. So, look, I think there are options to be had, but right now, and I guess I won't have a final thoughts video newsflash this week, but my initial read of how I choose to structure my team is probably going to be geared towards something like this. And maybe a Hadjar, a Hadjar or an Alonso, or even stick with Bortoletto and roll a transfer, something like this. So that's where my head's at right now. Again, practice will change a lot, and I will have a deadline stream this weekend to go through all of the free practice findings and data points. But without a final thoughts video, this is pretty much what my team selection initial read of the situation will be between now and the deadline. So that's going to be it for now. I've tried to cram a lot into one video before my deadline stream because I won't have a final thoughts video, but keep an eye out for my F1 Fantasy Strategist selection article on Formula1.com, which is posted every week. There will be specific asset breakdowns and analyses of the ones that I think you should be monitoring this week. But if you obviously don't get to reading that, you can certainly drop through for the 2-hour deadline stream ahead of Mexico this weekend. So as always, guys, please do throw the channel some love, drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel. And as I said, I'll be back for a deadline stream this weekend. So in the meantime, guys, have a great rest of your day. Good luck with your teams this weekend, and I will see you all very soon.